In every family ruled by immense wealth, secrets are not hidden in locked rooms. They're hidden in plain sight, disguised beneath polite smiles, orchestrated dinners, and carefully curated conversations. My grandfather built an empire that commanded respect and fear, where every decision rippled across generations. His mansion was a kingdom, and we, his descendants, were eager subjects waiting for his favor. But none of us expected that the person who would shift the course of our family's future wasn't sitting at the table, but quietly cleaning around it. It all began the day my millionaire grandfather overheard his housekeeper speak 5 languages fluently, a discovery that would ignite jealousy, expose betrayals, and leave us all questioning everything we thought we controlled. Enjoy the story. My grandfather was a man of towering presence, not because of his height, but because of the empire he had built with his own hands. His mansion stood like a monument to decades of ruthless business decisions, adorned with priceless art, grand staircases, and gardens manicured to perfection. Every corner whispered of wealth, but beneath the shimmering surface pulsed a quiet, constant tension. You see, in families like ours, love is a complicated currency, often traded for power, influence, and proximity to the throne. My grandfather's word was law, and every member of the family orbited around him, carefully calculating their moves, hoping to inherit a slice of his enormous fortune. But what none of us ever expected was that the quietest person in the mansion, someone we barely noticed, would soon become the epicenter of a storm that none of us were prepared to weather. Her name was Sofia. To most of us, she was just the housekeeper, diligent, efficient, invisible. She moved gracefully through the marble corridors, always wearing that simple navy blue uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes lowered out of respect. She never offered opinions, never interrupted conversations. Yet there was something about her that caught my attention over the years, a sharpness in her gaze, a presence that didn't quite fit the role she occupied. I often saw her observing, listening, not out of curiosity, but as if silently processing every word spoken around her. None of us questioned her quiet intelligence. After all, in a house ruled by wealth, who would suspect that the person polishing the silver could change the course of all our lives? That suspicion didn't exist, until one seemingly ordinary morning shattered the delicate balance we lived under. That morning started like any other. The sun bathed the mansion in its golden light, casting long, elegant shadows across the sprawling marble floors. My grandfather was hosting a high-profile business meeting in the Grand Library, the nerve center of his empire. The library was a world of its own, lined with ancient books whose pages hadn't been touched in decades, but stood as silent witnesses to countless billion-dollar decisions. The men seated around the massive oak table were not just guests. They were titans, European bankers, Middle Eastern investors, Asian conglomerate heads. They spoke in a rapid-fire blend of languages, effortlessly switching between English, French, German, Mandarin, and Spanish as if juggling balls in the air. It was a performance of global dominance, a flex of intellect and power that was as much for show as for substance. My grandfather sat at the head, calm and deliberate, listening more than speaking, letting the others reveal their hands first. As the conversation intensified, Sofia quietly entered the room, balancing a silver tray with coffee and freshly baked pastries. Her presence barely registered with the men in the room. She was part of the background, like the ornate chandeliers or the Persian rugs beneath their feet. She moved with practiced grace, setting down cups and plates without interrupting the flow of conversation. But then, as if fate itself had chosen that exact moment, one of the investors stumbled over a French term while explaining a complicated financial mechanism. He paused, searching for the right word, frustration creeping into his voice. And that's when Sofia, without hesitation, softly spoke. Répartition. The perfect word in flawless French, delivered with calm precision. The room fell instantly silent, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but electric. Every head turned toward her, including my grandfather's. His eyes narrowed, studying her not with annoyance but with a curiosity so intense it almost felt predatory. "You speak French?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Sofia straightened her posture, her hands resting gently on the tray. "Yes, sir." "And German, and Mandarin, and Spanish, and of course, English." The air thickened. The titans of industry, men who had come here to prove their superiority, now sat in stunned silence as the housekeeper, the invisible woman, revealed an unexpected mastery of languages that none of us had seen coming. My grandfather didn't say a word for several long seconds. His eyes locked on hers, analyzing, calculating, as if mentally rearranging 1,000 pieces on a chessboard in real time. And then, just as suddenly as the silence fell, he turned back to his guests and continued the meeting as if nothing had happened. But the energy in the room had changed. The dynamic had shifted. My grandfather had seen something that none of us had, and I knew in that moment that Sofia's life and ours were about to change forever. The following morning, the entire mansion vibrated with a different kind of tension, invisible to the untrained eye, but palpable to those of us who had lived long enough under my grandfather's rule to sense even the slightest shifts in his behavior. The staff moved with unusual caution, whispering to one another in the hallways, stealing glances toward his office doors. Rumors had already begun to circulate, and then, shortly after breakfast, Sofia was summoned to the private study, an invitation few ever received and even fewer survived unchanged. The heavy oak doors closed behind her, swallowing her into my grandfather's world of secrets. The rest of us could only speculate, pacing in silent frustration as the minutes turned into hours. When Sofia finally emerged, her expression was perfectly neutral. No trace of fear, no hint of triumph, only that same quiet dignity she always carried. But my grandfather's eyes, his eyes gleamed with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. It was as if he had uncovered a hidden treasure buried within the very walls of his own empire. That evening, during the customary family dinner, ACI, weekly spectacle where everyone performed their rehearsed roles of harmony and respect, my grandfather made the announcement that cracked the polished surface of our delicate family order. "As of today," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "Sofia will no longer serve this household as housekeeper. From this moment forward, she is my personal assistant." The words landed like a thunderclap across the endless dining table. My Aunt Margaret's fork froze halfway to her mouth, my cousin Thomas nearly choked on his wine, and my father, ever the strategist, narrowed his eyes, masking his fury behind a thin smile. In our world, proximity to my grandfather wasn't just about status. It was the currency that determined who would control the empire when he was gone. And now, a woman none of us had ever considered a threat had just been granted direct access to the throne. Sofia stood quietly behind my grandfather's chair, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture flawless. She neither looked proud nor humbled, which only deepened the unease rippling through the family. My grandfather continued, "She possesses skills that are rare and invaluable. Intelligence, discretion, and most importantly, loyalty. Qualities I value above all else." Nobody dared challenge him openly. No one ever did. But beneath the polite nods and forced smiles, calculations were already being made. Alliances were silently forming. In this family, power struggles didn't begin with shouting matches. They started with whispers behind closed doors. And I knew it was only a matter of time before those whispers turned into something much darker. That night, the mansion didn't sleep. The corridors remained alive with hushed conversations, like a symphony of suspicion playing just beneath the surface of elegance. Doors creaked softly open and shut as certain family members moved strategically between one another's rooms, sharing glances that carried years of unspoken alliances and resentments. In my father's private study, the real battle had already begun. I overheard them as I passed by. My father, my Uncle Robert, and my cousin Thomas, each one of them sitting around the heavy mahogany desk as if it were a war table. "He's lost his mind," Thomas whispered sharply, his voice coated in venom. "Elevating a maid, giving her access to everything. This is dangerous." Uncle Robert leaned in, his tone lower, colder. "She's not just a maid, apparently. She's playing him. Nobody hides that kind of talent for years unless they have a plan." My father remained silent for a moment, his face locked in the kind of calculating expression that made him feared, even among our own bloodline. "We underestimated her," he finally said, his voice measured, precise. "This isn't about her being a housekeeper. This is about my father looking for someone outside of us. Someone he believes is loyal because she has nothing to gain, yet." Thomas clenched his jaw, the panic seeping through his bravado. "Do you think she's after the inheritance?" "We're all after the inheritance," my father replied, coldly. "The question is, what does she already know, and who is really pulling the strings? People like her don't just appear. There's always a past, a reason." The weight of their paranoia hung heavy in the air, but I could sense something deeper. It wasn't just jealousy or fear of losing wealth. It was fear of losing control. My grandfather had always kept us under his thumb by pitting us against one another. A perfectly engineered ecosystem of rivalry that maintained his dominance. But now, introducing Sofia into that ecosystem threatened to destabilize everything. She was the unknown variable. And in a family built on carefully calculated power structures, the unknown was far more dangerous than any open enemy. As I stood outside that door, listening, I realized something chilling. Whatever game my grandfather was playing, he had already moved his pieces several steps ahead of us all. And Sofia was no pawn. The days that followed unfolded like the slow tightening of a noose, silent, deliberate, and suffocating. Sofia's transition from housekeeper to personal assistant was seamless, almost unsettlingly so. She shadowed my grandfather with precision, managing his schedule, interpreting during complex negotiations, and reviewing sensitive financial documents that most of us had never even seen. She was everywhere he was, at his side during investor meetings, advising him on overseas acquisitions, accompanying him on discreet trips to private banks. And all the while, the rest of us watched, powerless, as our proximity to my grandfather, and by extension, our perceived positions in the future of the empire, began to shrink. What unnerved me most was how effortlessly she carried the weight of her new role. She never flaunted her access, never sought approval from anyone else in the family. Her demeanor remained steady, humble, yet unmistakably sharp. The staff, once her peers, now addressed her with an air of careful respect. The board of directors, once untouchable titans themselves, found themselves taking notes as she dissected contracts and exposed flaws in proposals with quiet surgical precision. Even the foreign investors, men who once sneered at her anonymity, now greeted her with deference. The invisible housekeeper had become an indispensable force within my grandfather's empire. And yet, beneath the polished surface of this transition, the family seethed. Private conversations grew more desperate. Accusations of manipulation, blackmail, and hidden agendas began to circulate like a disease. My Aunt Margaret grew particularly unhinged, pacing the hallways at night, muttering wild theories. "She's seducing him," she whispered once to my mother during a tense brunch. "He's lonely and vulnerable. She's using it." But my mother only shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, this is something different. This is cold, strategic. She knows exactly what she's doing." As for my grandfather, his behavior was equally baffling. He remained entirely composed, even amused, as if watching the family's unraveling with a perverse sense of entertainment. One evening, during a private dinner, he broke the tension with a single sentence that sent a chill through the entire room. "It's fascinating, isn't it? How easily fear exposes true loyalty." The words hung in the air like smoke. None of us dared respond. The message was clear. He was watching us, testing us. And Sofia, silent at his side, remained unreadable as ever. But deep inside, I began to wonder, had she simply been in the right place at the right time? Or was all of this part of a long orchestrated plan far more brilliant than any of us dared admit? Weeks turned into months, and what once seemed like an isolated event was now a full-blown transformation of the household's power structure. My grandfather had grown more energized than we had seen him in years. His empire, which had already spanned continents, was expanding at a pace that left even his most seasoned advisors breathless. And at the center of every new deal, every delicate negotiation, every confidential briefing, was Sofia. She no longer stood silently in the background. She was now the one facilitating introductions, orchestrating strategies, even presenting proposals that carried his signature. The investors revered her intellect, the board feared her precision, and the family, we were crumbling under the weight of our growing irrelevance. The family gatherings became colder, sharper, each member calculating their words with surgical care. Smiles were tight, compliments were hollow. Every conversation masked a desperate search for leverage, any scrap of information that could be used to undermine Sofia's sudden rise. My cousin Thomas grew especially reckless, hiring private investigators to dig into her past. Weeks later, during one of our secret late-night meetings, he slammed a folder onto the table, eyes wild with the triumph of a man who thought he had found the key to dismantling an enemy. "She's not who she says she is," he hissed, flipping open the folder. "Her father wasn't a diplomat. He was a linguistics professor. She grew up moving from country to country, but not as some privileged ambassador's daughter." They struggled. She took jobs tutoring languages to survive. She worked in embassies. She built these skills out of necessity, not privilege. He paused, waiting for our faces to register outrage. But my father only leaned back, folding his hands with unsettling calm. "That's not a scandal, Thomas. That's survival. If anything, it makes her more dangerous." Uncle Robert nodded, grimly. "She's been preparing for this her entire life. She understands how people like us operate, and how to position herself without drawing attention." Thomas slammed his fist against the table. "We need to act, now." But my father's next words sent an icy shiver through all of us. "We won't survive a direct confrontation. Not yet. My father sees something in her that he hasn't seen in us. If we push too hard, we'll look desperate. Or worse, disloyal. We wait. We observe. And when she slips, and she will, we strike." His voice was cold, measured, terrifyingly patient. And in that moment, I realized the most dangerous war wasn't being fought openly. It was being fought in the shadows, where smiles masked knives and silence carried more weight than words. And yet, I couldn't shake one gnawing question from my mind. What if Sofia never slipped? As the weeks quietly unraveled, my grandfather began introducing Sofia to an entirely new echelon of influence, one that even many of us had never fully accessed. Private offshore holdings, hidden trust funds, discreet political contacts, layers of the empire that lived far beneath the polished surface of boardrooms and public ledgers. She now handled documents that most of the family never knew existed. She spoke in closed-door meetings with global advisors who only ever dealt directly with him. And curiously, my grandfather seemed to grow younger, sharper, invigorated by this new partnership. It wasn't just business. It was as if he had found in Sofia the one person who finally operated on his level, someone who wasn't desperate for his money, but instead respected the architecture of power itself. What disturbed the family most wasn't simply that she was gaining influence. It was how effortlessly she earned his trust. She asked no favors, made no demands, and never once attempted to curry personal benefit. Her restraint was infuriating because it left no obvious weakness to exploit. Every calculated move she made only deepened his faith in her. My grandfather, for the first time in years, even began revising elements of his will. Subtle but unmistakable signals that sent shockwaves through the family. At one particularly tense family dinner, when the subject of succession was carefully, almost fearfully brought up, my grandfather leaned back in his chair, tapping a single finger against his glass of wine, eyes cold and deliberate. "The empire doesn't belong to the one who wants it most," he said slowly, "but to the one who understands how to protect it best." Nobody spoke after that. The silence was suffocating. My Aunt Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. My father's jaw tightened, and Sofia, as always, stood silently at his side, her face unreadable, her gaze distant, as if this family's growing desperation was nothing more than irrelevant background noise. But inside, Those walls, a quiet war had escalated to its most dangerous phase. Spies were planted within the staff, phones were tapped, financial records were combed through for anomalies. Sofia's every move was being scrutinized under the most merciless microscope. And still, she moved through the chaos with unshakable calm, as though every invisible dagger thrown her way simply passed through smoke. I started to wonder if she was even playing the same game we were, or if, terrifyingly, she was playing a game we didn't even understand. Then came the night that changed everything, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through something far more dangerous: exposure. My grandfather hosted an exclusive gathering at the mansion, a rare convergence of international power brokers who controlled not just companies, but governments, markets, entire industries. The atmosphere was electric with unspoken deals, whispered alliances, and silent rivalries. It was the kind of event where fortunes could rise or fall based on a single sentence. And once again, Sofia was there, not as a servant, but standing confidently at my grandfather's side, flawlessly facilitating conversations that slipped between 5 languages as if they were one. But this time, the family was ready. Or so, they thought. Midway through the evening, one of Thomas's hired investigators managed to discreetly slip a dossier into my Uncle Robert's hand. The moment they had long prepared for was finally here. The dossier, they believed, contained undeniable proof of Sofia's betrayal. Offshore accounts in her name, secret communications with competitors, and even a falsified background that painted her as a carefully planted mole. It was, on the surface, devastating. And as my uncle quietly approached my grandfather with the thick envelope, his voice carried a rehearsed mixture of concern and loyalty. "Father," Robert said softly, leaning toward him, "I believe you. Need to see this before you trust her any further." The entire room seemed to pause as my grandfather took the envelope, his face impassive as he thumbed through the pages. For a long, heavy minute, the only sound was the distant clinking of glasses and faint music playing in the background. Everyone, the family, the guests, even Sofia, watched him closely, waiting for a reaction that would confirm the end of her rise. But instead, my grandfather closed the folder gently and set it aside. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, almost amused. "I've already seen all of this." A wave of confusion rippled through the family. My uncle's mouth fell open and Thomas's face drained of color. My grandfather continued, his gaze fixed coldly on them. "I ordered this investigation months ago. Every detail in that folder I knew long before any of you did. And what I see is not betrayal. What I see is resilience." He then turned to Sofia, who remained composed, though her eyes glistened with something almost imperceptible. Not fear, not relief, but something closer to respect. "The fact that she has survived circumstances none of you could even comprehend, and emerged with not only skill but loyalty, is precisely why she's here." The silence that followed was suffocating. The family's last weapon had failed. They hadn't uncovered a scandal. They had confirmed her worth. In that moment, everything shifted permanently. My grandfather had not only chosen her, he had publicly dismantled every attempt to dethrone her. The message was clear. Sofia wasn't merely his assistant. She was now something far more dangerous. She was untouchable. The following weeks unfolded like the aftermath of a brutal war where one side had been completely disarmed, not by violence but by the brutal elegance of psychological precision. The family's collective silence wasn't born of acceptance. It was paralysis. Every whispered conspiracy, every secret alliance that had been carefully crafted over months collapsed under the weight of my grandfather's public declaration. No one dared speak of Sofia anymore, not openly. But beneath the surface, bitterness fermented like poison, growing darker with each passing day. The hierarchy we had always known, built on blood, legacy, and silent intimidation, had been irrevocably altered by a woman who had once cleaned the very rooms we plotted in. Sofia, however, remained astonishingly consistent. She never gloated. She never once referenced the dossier or the failed attempt to discredit her. She continued executing her role with the same precision that had elevated her, managing billion-dollar negotiations, guiding legal teams, and overseeing expansion strategies with the calm of a seasoned general. The staff's deference toward her deepened. External partners now requested her presence directly, and my grandfather, who once played his children and grandchildren like pieces on a chessboard, had shifted all his focus toward grooming Sofia into something few of us even fully comprehended. But the most chilling shift came one afternoon in the mansion's private garden, a sanctuary where my grandfather often retreated for reflection. I was summoned to join him. The late afternoon sun bathed the ancient stone fountains in gold as I approached. He sat alone beneath the towering cypress trees, Sofia standing a few feet behind him, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the distant horizon. My grandfather gestured for me to sit, his voice softer than usual. "You've always been observant," he began, his tone oddly paternal. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at her?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I see someone who's earned your trust." He smiled faintly. "More than that, I see the future." His words struck me harder than I expected. "The future of the business?" I asked cautiously. "No," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The future of everything I've built. Power, true power, demands adaptability. It demands vision. Loyalty from family is often conditional, tied to blood, to inheritance. But loyalty born from survival, from struggle, that's something far stronger." He glanced toward Sofia with something resembling admiration, or perhaps recognition. "I've trained many men to lead, but I've rarely seen someone who understands how to protect an empire rather than simply inherit it." His message was unmistakable. Sofia was no longer just an assistant. She was becoming the architect of his legacy. And as I sat there listening, a cold realization settled deep within me. We were no longer competing with each other. We were now all standing on the outside of a fortress we thought we had been born inside of. In the weeks that followed, my grandfather's subtle preparations became bolder, as if he no longer felt the need to keep his intentions veiled. A private, legal team, one none of us had seen before, was brought into the estate. They were discreet, highly specialized, and always escorted directly to my grandfather's study. Documents were drafted. Long meetings behind closed doors stretched late into the night. The mansion's energy shifted yet again, no longer tense, but eerily silent, as if everyone had collectively surrendered to the new reality, but couldn't bring themselves to say it aloud. And through it all, Sofia remained a paradox. She still carried herself with the same quiet grace that had defined her from the start, never once betraying even a hint of ambition. Yet she was now consulted on every strategic decision, invited into the private circle where only my grandfather once stood alone. Her suggestions carried weight, her analyses shaped deals, and her presence began to command a respect that transcended even the family name. Investors spoke of her brilliance with genuine reverence. Competitors whispered about her precision. She was no longer merely part of my grandfather's operation. She was becoming its nucleus. The final blow to the old family order came during an emergency family meeting my grandfather himself summoned. An unprecedented move that immediately sent a wave of fear through the entire bloodline. We gathered in the grand dining hall, every seat filled, every face painted with nervous anticipation. My grandfather sat at the head, flanked by his attorneys on one side and Sofia on the other. She didn't sit behind him this time. She sat beside him. "I've called you all here," he began calmly, "because it's time for transparency." He paused, letting the weight of that word sink in. "For years I've watched this family compete not to build, but to take, to position, to manipulate. And while I understand such behavior comes with power, it has exhausted me. I've built an empire strong enough to survive markets, governments, and global shifts. But what I see now is a fragile dynasty fractured from within." His gaze swept across each of us, cold, sharp, surgical. No one dared speak. "That ends today," he continued. "Effective immediately. I am restructuring all legal control of my holdings. The operational control of my businesses will be transferred to a trust, one that Sofia will oversee as primary executor. The room erupted into stunned gasps. My Aunt Margaret half rose from her chair. My cousin Thomas slammed his fist onto the table. My father's face drained of all color. His jaw clenched so tightly I feared his teeth might crack. "This is madness," Thomas finally exploded. "She's an outsider. She's not even family." My grandfather's reply was swift and cutting. "And yet she has proven more loyal than any of you. She has built nothing on entitlement, only on competence. She understands not just how to preserve wealth, but how to protect power." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Voices shouting over one another, chairs scraping against polished marble floors, years of suppressed rage exploding into one desperate moment. But through it all, Sofia remained silent, her expression composed, her eyes calm. She didn't need to defend herself. My grandfather had already done it for her, and in that instant, the hierarchy we had all grown up inside was not only shattered, it was erased. In the aftermath of that meeting, the mansion transformed into a hollow shell of its former self. Conversations that once hummed through its gilded halls evaporated. The grand parties, the endless stream of advisors, the orchestrated family dinners, all came to an abrupt halt. The family dispersed like defeated soldiers after a lost war, retreating to their private corners of the estate or fleeing altogether to distant properties, nursing their humiliation in silence. My grandfather, however, seemed at peace. More than that, he radiated a strange, almost serene satisfaction, as if he had been waiting years for this moment. Sofia moved through the mansion as she always had, but now her presence carried a gravitational pull. She wasn't flaunting her newfound power. She simply existed above the petty games we had all played for so long. The remaining staff treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. The board of directors now communicated directly with her. Even the government liaisons and global partners began addressing her as the true architect behind the empire's future. She wasn't replacing my grandfather. She was becoming the living embodiment of his legacy while he was still alive to witness it. One evening, I found myself once again summoned to the private garden. This time, it was Sofia who requested my presence. The air was cool, and the fountain's gentle murmur filled the heavy silence between us as I approached. She stood beside the old stone bench where my grandfather often sat, hands folded, her gaze distant, as though she were looking far beyond the horizon. "I wanted to speak with you privately," she said softly, her voice carrying its usual calm, confidence. "Because you're one of the few who hasn't openly attacked me." I said nothing, unsure whether this was a compliment or a prelude to something darker. "You've watched this unfold," she continued, her voice steady but not unkind. "You've seen how fragile this family truly is beneath the surface. Your grandfather saw it too. That's why he chose me." Her honesty was disarming. There was no smugness, no gloating, just a clinical acknowledgement of what had transpired. "I never wanted their inheritance," she said, her gaze finally meeting mine. "I wanted to build something that could survive, beyond greed." He understood that, and he trusted me with it. There was a sincerity in her tone that unnerved me even more than her rise to power. She wasn't playing a game anymore. This was who she truly was. A woman who had navigated through unimaginable complexity without ever needing to betray herself. And somehow I realized that terrified my family more than anything else. As I sat there listening, a chilling understanding settled deep within me. The empire my grandfather had built would live on, not through bloodlines, but through the quiet, relentless brilliance of the woman none of us had ever seen coming. The transformation wasn't just inside the mansion. It extended far beyond. The financial world quickly adapted to this new reality. Headlines whispered about the mysterious rise of my grandfather's silent protege. Journalists speculated, but none could penetrate the fortress of discretion Sofia maintained. Her name surfaced in financial circles as a ghost-like power broker, the woman who spoke 5 languages, who negotiated billion-dollar mergers behind closed doors, who preserved an empire while its founding family tore itself apart. And with every passing month, her legend grew while our relevance faded. The family fractured into smaller, powerless factions. My cousin Thomas retreated to Europe, nursing his humiliation in private exile. My Aunt Margaret vanished into her network of charity boards, desperate to cling to some public image of influence. Even my father, once the most feared strategist in the family, reduced his presence, avoiding the mansion altogether. The house had become Sofia's domain, not because she forced anyone out, but because she made their presence irrelevant. And yet, through all this, my grandfather's health quietly began to wane. Subtly at first: fatigue, brief hospital visits, extended periods of rest. The empire had reached a point where he no longer needed to steer it actively. Sofia's control was absolute, and she carried his vision forward with a discipline that astonished even his oldest advisors. His decline, however, seemed almost intentional, as if, having finally secured the future of his creation in the hands of someone truly capable, he was now allowing himself to let go. One evening, as autumn winds curled through the towering cypress trees, my grandfather summoned me once more. His voice had grown weaker, but his mind remained razor sharp. "You see it now, don't you?" he asked, his breath shallow. "What I built was never meant to be passed like a trophy. It was meant to endure." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. The weight of what he was saying crushed something inside me I hadn't even fully realized was still alive. The hope that somehow we might return to the old family order. "They would have destroyed it given the chance," he continued. "They saw wealth as a prize. She sees it as responsibility." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, his voice quieter than before. "One day, they'll call her ruthless. They'll call her cold. But you and I will know she was necessary." And for the first time, I understood that my grandfather's most brilliant move hadn't been the empire he built, but the person he chose to preserve it. A woman we never once imagined could eclipse us all. The winter months brought a heavy stillness to the mansion, as if the very walls themselves were preparing for the inevitable. My grandfather's physical presence grew weaker with each passing day, yet Sofia remained constant at his side. Not as a caretaker, but as his final confidant, his executor, his chosen legacy. The family, though still bound by blood, became fragmented shadows circling from a distance, unable to penetrate the new order that had crystallized around her. And strangely, in those final days, my grandfather seemed content, almost peaceful, as if, after decades of calculated dominance, he was finally witnessing the completion of his most intricate design. On one particularly cold evening, as snow gently blanketed the estate's sprawling gardens, Sofia requested my presence one last time. She led me to my grandfather's private study, that sacred chamber where empires had been built and dismantled with whispered words and signatures. He was resting in his grand leather chair, wrapped in an elegant blanket, the golden glow of the fireplace casting soft flickers across his aging face. Sofia stood silently beside him, her hands resting gently on the back of his chair. He opened his eyes as I entered, his voice thin but steady. "I wanted you to be here for this." Sofia stepped forward, placing a thick leather-bound portfolio on the desk. She opened it carefully, revealing pages of complex legal documentation, final amendments to the trust, sealed directives that would activate upon his passing. But as she turned to the final page, my grandfather gestured weakly for me to come closer. "This," he whispered, "isn't about who inherits. It's about who ensures it lives." He looked up at Sofia, his eyes filled with something that startled me. Not power, not pride, but trust. Deep, complete trust. She has no blood ties to this family, no entitlement, no delusions of grandeur. And because of that, she will protect this empire from the one enemy none of you ever recognized. I swallowed, unable to resist asking, "What enemy?" He smiled faintly, his voice barely audible now. "Yourselves." The truth of his words hung heavy in the air, undeniable and brutal. For decades, we had all battled each other, desperate to claim pieces of his empire, blind to the rot we had collectively become. And only now did I fully grasp the genius of his final move. To save the empire, he had to free it from us. Sofia gently placed her hand on his shoulder, steadying him, as his breathing grew shallow, and in that moment, watching them together, I realized that my grandfather's final heir wasn't someone who had fought for power, but someone who had been chosen precisely because she never sought it. The following morning, the mansion awoke, under a heavy gray sky that seemed to mourn with us. My grandfather had passed quietly in the early hours, his breath fading softly like the final note of a symphony only he could hear. The staff moved silently through the house, dressed in black, their faces lowered out of respect. The family gathered once more beneath the vast crystal chandeliers, not out of unity, but out of obligation. The air was thick with unspoken tension, grief entangled with lingering resentment, each of us painfully aware of how drastically the future had shifted. The funeral was a spectacle of power, attended by dignitaries, corporate leaders, and international financiers who flew in from every corner of the world. But even among the most powerful, all eyes eventually found their way to Sofia. She stood at the front, not beside the family but slightly apart, as if to visually mark the strange paradox of her position. Outside the bloodline, yet now at its very center. She wore no extravagant jewelry, no grand display of dominance. Her presence was her power, controlled, measured, impeccably poised. As the eulogies concluded, the reading of the final will commenced in the private hall, away from the spectacle of cameras and distant guests. The family sat in stiff silence, each bracing for the confirmation of what we already suspected, but hadn't yet been forced to confront. The attorney unfolded the documents slowly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. My client, with full mental capacity and of sound mind, enacts these final directives. The legal language unfolded in cold, unflinching detail. The distribution of assets, properties, trusts, all designed not for division among family, but for preservation under a central governing trust controlled entirely by Sofia. The wealth was still ours technically, but the control, the power, the future, it was hers. Aunt Margaret gasped audibly. Thomas's chair scraped violently against the marble floor as he stood, his voice quivering with a rage he could no longer contain. "You have no right to this. You manipulated him." The attorney raised his hand, silencing him before he could continue. "The directives are legally binding. All parties have had months of opportunity to challenge them. No contests were filed. This meeting is not for debate." My father sat, motionless, his face hollow, drained of the calculation that once defined him. The war was over, not lost. Over. And Sofia? She never flinched, never looked at any of us. Her focus remained steady, her breathing calm, as if she had long prepared herself for this exact moment. In the deepest part of me, beneath the bitterness, I couldn't help but feel something unexpected. A strange, reluctant respect. Not for what she took, but for how she took nothing and yet claimed everything. In the months that followed, life inside the mansion shifted into a quiet rhythm none of us could have foreseen. The grand corridors that once echoed with family politics and whispered betrayals became calm, almost monastic. Sofia moved through the estate not as a ruler flaunting her triumph, but as a steward safeguarding a legacy that none of us had been worthy to inherit. She met daily with financial advisors, oversaw mergers, expanded charitable foundations in my grandfather's name, and fortified the empire's influence in ways that even he, in his brilliance, might not have imagined. What she had been entrusted with was not simply wealth, it was the stability of an entire dynasty that had nearly consumed itself from within. The family, once ravenous for power, slowly dissolved into irrelevance. Some drifted into obscurity. Others clung to minor roles in subsidiary businesses, desperate to maintain some sliver of proximity to the empire we once believed would be ours by right. And me? I remained. Not out of ambition or hope for position, but because I had come to understand something the rest never could. My grandfather hadn't merely chosen Sofia to preserve his wealth. He had chosen her to break a cycle of entitlement. A cycle of power, control, of decay, of inherited destruction disguised as legacy. One evening, nearly a year after his passing, I found myself once again in the private garden where so much had begun. Sofia sat alone on the stone bench beneath the cypress trees, the same calm expression on her face as always. The moonlight bathed the gardens in a soft silver glow, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured hedges. As I approached, she looked up and offered a small, almost fragile smile, the first genuine softness I had seen from her in all this time. "You stayed," she said softly. "I did," I replied, lowering myself onto the bench beside her. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The air was cool, the silence strangely comforting. Finally, I turned to her and asked the question that had haunted me since the very beginning. "Did you ever plan any of this? From the start?" She looked forward again, eyes tracing the horizon as if weighing her answer carefully. "No," she said finally. "I planned to survive. Nothing more. But when opportunities reveal themselves, you have to decide who you want to be in that moment. Your grandfather saw in me something I hadn't yet seen in myself." Her voice softened, almost tender now. "Power doesn't corrupt everyone. Sometimes it simply reveals who was never meant to carry it." I exhaled slowly, the final weight of it all settling deep within me. We had spent years fighting for something we didn't even understand, while the person who never sought it had become the only one strong enough to protect it. As we sat together under the pale moonlight, I realized the truth my grandfather had seen long before any of us. Legacy isn't about blood. It's about who is strong enough to hold it without letting it poison them. And somehow, impossibly, it had never belonged to us. It had always belonged to her.